Hello, I hope you're having a great day. Today is part 8 in a series in which I'm giving prophetic talks on the act of preaching. And today we turn to the topic of eloquence and the importance of eloquence and how it grows out of freedom in the act of preaching. Now we're going to see that this topic has surprising connections to other issues that you might not have thought about. I'm going to argue that preachers must strive after pulpit eloquence. And startling, we're going to talk about Herman Bavinck on pulpit eloquence. Now, I realize that in the 21st century, many preachers think that any language about eloquence is like old-fashioned. It's like an out-of-date exhortation. Isn't eloquence a concept that's wrapped up with a classical education? Weren't the ancient Greeks rhetoricians? And so the study of rhetoric seems to be as old-fashioned as learning Latin and studying the history of the old Romans. And we no longer advocate learning Latin as teenagers. How many of us have read Cicero in Latin or even an English translation? So given the contemporary bias against the very idea of eloquence in preaching and in public speaking, I am glad that I can use a theological heavyweight to counter this trend. Now, in American politics, for example, I find that most speech giving and most speeches absolutely lack eloquence. Now, sometimes, of course, I know highly paid speech writers work on putting together an essay, a speech that has all the right little turns to it. But reading something like this off a teleprompter isn't what we call true eloquence. The Dutch Reformed theologian Herman Bavinck was asked to give a talk at the Theological University in Kampen, and he was asked to speak on preaching. Well, he decided that he would speak about the need for eloquence. Now, isn't that striking? It's the end of the 19th century. Many Dutch Reformed pastors would have received a pretty classical education, and yet he felt the need, when he was given this one opportunity to lecture on preaching to the students at the Theological University, on November 28 of 1889, the subject he chose was eloquence. Now, I'm struck by the fact that the systematic theologian selected eloquence as the topic of the one recorded lecture that we have from him on preaching. In fact, the only developed and lengthy work on preaching that we have from Bavinck's pen is about pulpit eloquence. So why does a Dutch systematic theologian consider this topic important? I get the sense at the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century, there's been a very negative view of eloquence. And the subject is neglected. The whole idea of rhetoric and eloquence is passé. Bavinck thought that Dutch Reformed preachers in the late 19th century were in self-denial about the value of eloquence. So in the foreword to the published booklet of this lecture on preaching, on eloquence, which was published under the title Eloquence, Bavinck explains why he wants a new edition to be available. He says, a new edition was deemed preferable because the holy eloquence in question is in large part an undiscovered land in our Christian endeavors. Dutch pulpits are not presently overflowing with good, powerful speakers, never mind preachers. Now that's quite a strong criticism of the Dutch pulpit at the end of the 19th century. Bavinck finds godly eloquence missing from Reformed pulpits. He considers the lack of a holy eloquence a threat to the welfare of the church at a time when he said that the secular press was so influential. Now, this causes us to smile almost. He writes that in the past, the pulpit had a greater influence on the consciences of men. But in his day, he said the newspaper reaches the furthest parts of the society, in so doing exerting influence on the spirit and dominating public opinion. So Bavinck is concerned about the great effect of newspapers. He wrote how Spurgeon described the English as a press-ridden people. Now, I almost laugh at the naivete of a Bavinck who thinks that the newspapers and written press were such a challenge to the pulpit. He has given his lecture on eloquence before the rise of the radio, before the invention of television, before the rise of the internet, before smartphones. Bavinck was afraid that the newspapers and the press were becoming the masters of Dutchmen's consciences. Well, if that's the case, we should almost be freaking out about how television and the internet today are becoming Americans' consciences. Bavinck writes that if preachers want to remain master of the people's conscience, they must ensure that they remain masters of the word. Now, he understood the high calling of preachers and the power of the word preached. He said the meaning of preaching cannot easily be overestimated, nor can the worth of the office of preacher, to be a verbi divini minister, servant of the divine word, one who shares from the hiddenness of God, who declares words of eternal life, which earthly position could be compared to this. Ministers who wield the sword of the Spirit, Bavinck says, possess a greater power than that of monarchs and world leaders, because Bavinck says he who rules the Spirit is mightier than he who captures a city. Now, if Bavinck believed that eloquence was important for preachers more than 100 years ago, that is, speaking well so that you seize the attention of your hearers, how much more important eloquence is today in the age of the online media and in a television, almost post-television age now, the rise of the internet. How much harder is it to catch the attention of our hearers today who are used to looking at their smartphones and paging from one thing to another? And now, how many different kinds of media vie for influence and the conscience of our people? So if Bavinck thought that the press in 1889 was such a threat to the conscience of Christians, how can we even begin to describe the threat the media poses today? And sin has developed. Today, the media is omnipresent. I get the feeling that ministers today suppose that eloquence is it's somehow an old-fashioned subject. With the rejection of classical educations, there's also been a rejection of the old Roman emphasis on rhetoric and communication. Now, I know there's a few outposts of classical education, but I think that preachers feel that the old books they read in seminary, books by old Presbyterians who were homileticians, who wrote about sacred rhetoric, they think, well, those books were really for a different age. Now, in his lecture, Herman Bavinck felt the need to deal with the charge that the study of eloquence is a study of sophistry. And I think that is exactly the issue today. People think that if you strive to communicate in a way that is eloquent, you're just trying to be a sophist. You're just trying to act wise and snucker people into thinking that what you say is profound. As if somehow there is this dichotomy between teaching what is true and right and good and then teaching in a way that's eloquent and powerful. Now, I suppose people might try to quote the Apostle Paul, who says that when he came preaching, he didn't come with worldly eloquence, but he simply preached Christ and him crucified. And of course, there's something to that. But don't try to tell me that Paul lacks eloquence. Read the epistle to the Romans. Read his epistle to the Ephesians. Read his writings. Read them out loud. After all, he spoke them out loud often to someone like Tertius, who would write it down. So Paul communicated what became his letter to the Romans, for example, or to the Corinthians, verbally. He spoke it, and what power, what beauty there is to his words. And if you don't think that the psalmist or the psalmists are eloquent, then you just simply haven't read the Psalms. So Bavinck rebuts the charge that if you focus on trying to have eloquence in the pulpit, that somehow you're becoming a sophist. And I think Bavinck can help contemporary preachers by his demonstration of what holy eloquence actually is and why it is vital for the ministry of the word. And along the way, we have some surprises here about where this type of eloquence originates. So here we have a professor of systematic theology who also emphasizes eloquence in preaching. And it isn't surprising to learn that guess what Bavinck often did? He preached extemporaneously. And that wasn't simply by chance. For example, in Bavinck's first and only pastorate in Franeker, Bavinck wrote early on in his diary, "Preached in Franeker on Isaiah 53 verses 4 through 6 and Catechism question 1. Completely improvised for the first time. It went well." Notice what he's saying there. He's saying he preached extemporaneously. James Eglinton writes that this practice of preaching with no or minimal notes remained Bavinck's norm, and explains why, despite his decades of preaching, only one of his sermons became available in print. It is crucial that you understand why Bavinck as a preacher was interested in holy eloquence. It was because he viewed preaching as an oral event. The minister who preaches without notes experiences the power of the pulpit. The extemporaneous preacher can give free rein to his emotions in the act of preaching. And the reference to emotions is for Bavinck the critical thing. He is going to make a crucial argument that I think is so important, that holy emotions are really the source of godly eloquence. In other words, if you want to preach with eloquence, your emotions in your heart have to be fired with zeal about what it is you're preaching on. When the preacher preaches extemporaneously, he has the opportunity to express his own faith in the moment and act of preaching. Eglinton tells us that Bavinck, as a student, began more and more to enjoy preaching. We're told from then on, Bavinck came to find increasing joy in the act of preaching. And it is especially the extemporaneous preacher who can enjoy the act of preaching. Preaching is a joy as the preacher celebrates the gospel truths that he has internalized. He delights in the spontaneous expression of his face and the overflow of his emotions in response to the great gospel truths he has come to know and wrap his mind around. The preacher experiences joy when he spontaneously comes up with the right words to express the passion of his heart. There is deep joy when you have profound feeling in your heart and then you find a way to express and communicate it. And so there's deep joy in a minister's heart when he can speak to the congregation from his heart to theirs as he experiences the fear of God or the holiness of God or sorrow for sin. Now, after only 2 short years in Franeker, Bavinck accepted a call to become a professor at the seminary in Kampen. A ruling elder in Franeker commented on how the congregation lost a very valued teacher and his glorious preaching. The congregation felt the loss of an eloquent preacher, you see. But now we come to the big thing. I want you to listen close to this. What is the source of holy eloquence? That is the big issue. That's where Bavinck can help you. Bavinck begins his speech with a discussion of the value of speaking well. He says speaking well is an adornment for each person, and for the Christian, man or woman, it is an exquisite virtue. He divides his lecture into 3 parts. The principle of eloquence first, the essence of eloquence, and then third, the form of eloquence. In the first part of the speech, he develops the principle of eloquence. The most important insight in this part of the speech is his understanding of the source of eloquence. The source is the heart, or the emotions of the heart. See, this is where godly eloquence differs from the sophists. The sophists, they say things they don't even believe. They're just trying to win arguments. So they're trying to fool people. But you see, the godly minister, he has wonderful and holy and important emotions, and his emotions are the seedbed of his eloquence. So Bavinck feels the need in the first part of his speech to distinguish between the use and abuse of language. He makes the point that wicked men abuse language. But that doesn't mean, just because, for example, the sophists are filled with sophistry, that doesn't mean that Christians shouldn't be eloquent. Yes, human language is corrupted due to sin. And it's true, the Bible says that God will hold us accountable for every idle word. And how we communicate is important. We shouldn't just use meaningless words. We shouldn't just use conventional terms, he says. And fallen man misuses language. Think of how Adolf Hitler and the Nazis misused language and rhetoric in order to get people to buy into Nazism. So Bavinck gives 3 examples of the misuse of language. First, he writes that there is truth, and Goethe's remark that a man lies as soon as he becomes polite. Second, he mentions Talleyrand. He says, as we also pay attention to the dark side of our human nature, it seems that Talleyrand was certainly right to say language was invented in order to conceal our thoughts. Third, he mentions the misuse of the French language in Talleyrand's time. He says at that time the French were the undoubted masters of conversation, which is to say the art, as it is rightly named, of carrying out the most gallant conversations on the most frivolous subjects in the finest forms. So wicked people can speak with eloquence. They can speak in a way that sounds beautiful, that captures the attention of the people they are talking to. But language can be used in the service of lies and evil and vanity. Yet Bavinck affirms that the origin of eloquence in ungodly men is their heart and emotions. So it was Adolf Hitler's evil emotions that played a role in the type of eloquence that he had when he had these massive rallies. And Bavinck makes some very, very, very insightful comments about the source of eloquence. The source of holy eloquence, he says, is the burning heart of the redeemed preacher. As with language, the source of true eloquence does not lie in the reasoning mind, he argues. Indeed, it lies much less in an act or decision of the will, but rather lies behind both in his heart and spirit, from which life goes forth, also from the life of eloquence. So notice what Bavinck's crucial insight is. His crucial insight is that eloquence finds its origin in the heart and emotions. Okay, what is going on then when you're listening to a preacher and there's no eloquence? It's because something isn't going on in his heart and in his emotions. Why is it that ministers have a certain type of eloquence and yet it seems fake and all airy? It's because the minister is just trying to sound right. He's trying to sound good. He's trying to be eloquent, but his heart isn't on fire, or he doesn't have the emotion of sadness or grief that he should be expressing, or the marvelous sense of hope that he should have, or he's preaching about heaven, and there's clearly no joy whatsoever in his heart, and it certainly isn't showing itself on his face. Bavinck cites the proverb, "It is the heart that inspires eloquence." Now, that is the point I want you to take away from this talk. Preacher, if you would be eloquent, you need to experience the truths of the gospel. You need to feel the realities of the gospel. You need to feel and sense the holiness of God, what God requires in his law. If you're not eloquent in the pulpit, you need to fan into flame holy emotions. And that's why preaching is hard. Preaching is hard because it is a spiritual activity. And we, just like all the saints, have times when our emotions aren't on fire. And preachers who are lukewarm will not produce eloquence. Go find someone, for example, who's not so excited about something and say, well, tell me about it. And, they will tell you in a lukewarm way about the thing because their heart's not on fire. On the other hand, if you have someone who's a big fan of the Cubs, for example, they just went to a big game and the Cubs won. Well, because the person's all excited, don't be surprised if you listen to every word they say. And so the secret of eloquence, Bavinck says, lies in the soul. He says, let the heart's passion come to the word and eloquence will be born. So Bavinck helps us to understand why we do not hear enough eloquence in the pulpit. We do not have passionate preachers. We do not have preachers who believe strongly and therefore speak with eloquence. They believe, but they don't believe strongly enough. They don't help us to see invisible spiritual realities like they ought to be able to help us. See, if their faith was stronger and they were filled with amazement at spiritual realities, there would be more eloquence. We don't have enough eloquence in the pulpit because we don't have enough passion, enough ardency, enough fervency. But when the heart is overcome by emotion, then holy eloquence is unleashed. Bavinck says, and if our heart becomes so affected, so touched, or when our beautiful distraction is brought to the fore and our heart is carried by it, and thus is awoken in passion, regardless of which one. And now he mentions a different emotions: love, hate, sorrow, compassion, indignation, shock, fear, angst, terror. He says, if our conscience is touched, and the waves of the life of the soul are set heaving, if our spirit is driven and is set in motion and delight, then the real source of eloquence is unlocked within us. Deep inner feeling is the principle of oratory. It is the soul's sensitivity to be jarred and aghast. So preachers become eloquent, you see, when they deeply experience the emotions of the Christian life, whether sorrow or love or hate or hope or wonder. And it doesn't matter how loud they are speaking. Sometimes the emotion you experience is one that leads to great quietness and even whispering. But you know, and I know, when a minister's experience emotion, in fact, it wakes us up, we pay attention. Who is your favorite preacher? He probably is eloquent. And he's eloquent because he does things like celebrate the triune God. He celebrates the supremacy of Jesus Christ. He loves his salvation. He celebrates the things he preaches. When a preacher preaches with emotions, then the saints are inexorably carried along by his passion. That is, those who have the Holy Spirit indwelling them. When the minister considers something to be a great moment, well, then we tend to consider it important as well. When the minister becomes excited about a glorious truth, we want to have the same emotion. When a minister is grieved by sin, we also want to grieve over our own sins. And so there's a crucial thing here that I want you to reflect on. Why do you need to internalize your sermon? So that you think it through, so that you get it in your heart and in your soul, so that you can mull it over, so that you can perceive from all these different angles what this word means, what the implications are, the wonders of it, the marvels it reveals. And then when you get in the pulpit, guess what? That holy emotion, those emotions that overcome your soul, are going to be the mother of eloquence.